The Charles Adler Show starts now.
So a lot of people like to mock social media. I'm not crazy about many social media platforms, but I am crazy about Twitter. And the reason I'm crazy for Twitter is not because people turn it into a sewer in certain Twitter neighborhoods and certainly into my replies whenever I'm political. That is just water off a duck's back when I look at the positives that I get out of Twitter. And one of the best positives is I meet people who I otherwise would never meet. Interesting people who are not necessarily household names. Experts in their field who aren't necessarily accredited as experts. Now, before people go off half-cocked on that, I'm not talking about people who are anti-science or, the anti-vaxxers and all. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a guest like Alex Bowers, who's joining us in just moments from Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Alex Bowers arrived in this country less than 6 months ago. He is an expert on history, but more specifically, he is an expert on Canadian military history, even though he's a Brit. And now I'm going to bring Alex Bowers on to tell you the rest of the story, as the great mentor Paul Harvey used to say. Paul Harvey was one of the people who inspired me when I was listening to radio, and he was one of the people who said to me, I think there may be a future in radio for me because this guy's a great storyteller. Now, speaking of great storytellers like Paul Harvey, Alex Bowers tells stories on his YouTube channel. And Alex, before we do anything else, I usually say, welcome to the Charles Adler Show podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
But in this case, I want to do it a little differently. On behalf of a nation of 40 million people in this wonderful country, welcome Alex Bowers. Welcome to Canada.
Charles, thank you so much. And I've been feeling that welcome everywhere I've gone so far. It just, I've never had a moment where I felt like I didn't belong. It's been wonderful, the whole ride.
By the way, are you as grateful to Twitter as I am? I mean, you're pretty busy on Twitter.
Yeah,
if you weren't there, I wouldn't know anything about you. And I'm just wondering if you've got a similar experience because Twitter is getting a bad name for all the reasons I don't want to cite right now. But isn't Twitter for you as well a place where you get to meet people you otherwise would never meet?
100%, absolutely. I mean, look, I've got my issues with Twitter just as much as so many people do at the moment. But for me personally, it's been a stepping stone into something that it's almost beyond words. It's I when I first came over here, I had like a modest Twitter following. I shared sort of things about Canadian military history that I found fascinating. But the moment I went to the airport with my wife, Annie Bowers, I posted a picture of us standing outside of Gatwick Airport, holding a Canadian flag saying we're about to move out. And within minutes, it felt, I just accumulated all of these hundreds of thousands of well wishes from Canadians and following me and everything. And they've been following my story ever since. And it's been a real privilege to share my story with them through Twitter.
So I think most people paying attention to this right now are saying, he's a Brit and he's chosen Canada. Pardon me for throwing out what for many, many years was called a Canadian inferiority complex. That's not where it comes from with me, but I always like to be asking the questions that I know the public is asking. Mm-hmm. And I think pretty sure about this. I'm intuiting that many of the members of the public are asking, why did you choose Canada over the United States?
Okay, well, there's a really simple answer to that, and that is the fact that in my country, there's been this prevailing notion in the Second World War in particular that from 1940, after the Dunkirk evacuations, to the entry of the United States into the Second World War in December 1941, that Britain stood alone. And that's always bothered me because although there's been technicalities to that statement that some historians have chosen to argue, I have never, because I believe it diminishes the individual identities of countries that chose to stand by us almost from the very beginning. And I've chosen Canada in particular because even though Canada did, by that point, have the autonomy to decide whether or not it was going to support Britain. It waited a week to decide. It spoke, in Parliament about it, and then they decided, no, we're going to come into to support them, and we just don't talk about it enough in my country. We talk about America saving us supposedly, and of course they had such an important role in the Second World War, but I just feel like we need to be talking more about the countries such as Canada that were also there almost from the very beginning.
So it may not surprise you that some of my history teachers in elementary school and high school were British. And one of the things I remember, and I don't know which grade I learned this in, but I do remember these two dates. And if I'm off, tell me. You're the historian, not yours truly. I'm a fan of history, but I'm hardly a historian. The way I remember it from school, it was September 3rd that Britain declared war on Germany, and this was following the German invasion of Poland, I think. So I believe it was September 3rd, and then I believe Canada, declared war against Germany, joining our British ally. I think it was 6 days later. For some reason, September 9th sticks out in my memory.
I think it was September.
Is that close?
I believe it was September 10th.
All right.
But yes, very close.
Yeah, I'm off by a day. Well,
I'm sure someone will be correcting me for all I know.
All right. So without not bashing the States here, it would be very disingenuous. I've got family there and friends there. Many listeners and viewers there. The United States was very good to me. So this is not a bash. It's just an ask. So we joined on September 10th in 1939. When did the U.S. join Britain and the other allies?
So the United States had been providing some sort of material supports to Britain in the years before they joined, but they actually entered the war officially after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So we're talking, several, many months after war was declared by Britain and by Canada. Obviously, when they came, they had a huge importance on the influence of the war. The sheer numbers and the material that they sort of brought to it. But obviously, they took time for them to mobilize, and in the meantime, Canada was still always there beside us.
Is it fair to say, once again, not a bash, because objectively speaking, if the United States had not entered the war, it would have been much easier for Germany to prevail. So I just want to put all the cards on the table here.
Yep.
But numbers matter, years matter, lives matter. Had the United States entered when Canada did, that is in September of 1939, would many lives have been saved? And I'll take it one step further, and I know some people think this is an unfair question, but you're the history expert, so it's fair to ask you, is it possible that Hitler would have been stopped much earlier had the United States entered the war earlier?
I'm always quite cautious about speculating because obviously these things didn't happen. But obviously the sheer scale of what the United States could have brought to bear, I think you could probably make a fair argument, but you'll have to forgive me if I tread a little carefully with that one.
No, it's fine. I just think that once again, I want to be asking the questions that I think
absolutely, and I think these are important things to be talking about.
Yeah, because Britain and Canada and others lost a lot of people between 1939 and 1941, and so I think it's always out there as a question. Might things have gone better for the Allies? Might the war have ended sooner had the Americans gotten in sooner? And I can tell you this from all of the interviewing I did with historians in the United States during my tour of duty there in the 90s. Many American historians do believe that. But I want to move forward to the business of expertise. I said in the preamble that sometimes people think that only those people who are officially accredited can be experts. So without further ado, I want to let people know that you are not considered an accredited historian. Tell us what that's about.
No, absolutely not. I've always put my cards on the table, and I've always stated explicitly that I'm not university trained. I've not studied at all about this. I mean, to be honest, I actually got a D at school for my history. And I think, again, it's the way that things are taught. And I do feel like that's an important thing. And that's why I felt that I struggled at school, because it's never really inspired me the way that my teachers ever, they spoke to me about history. And I feel like it's important, obviously, that you have these qualified historians that are there stating the facts as they are. And, they rightfully, deserve the bulk of our attention. But I don't think, I equally believe there's space for people like me who have a passion for it, and are here to tell stories in a unique way, that so long as they're based on fact and you use the same resources as an academic historian would, I do feel, and I do believe strongly, that there is room for both parties,
So have you spent a lot of time in university libraries? And I ask because long before I got to McGill University, when I was a high school student, I was allowed to. It's not that I had any kind of privilege. I was just a very poor blue-collar kid. But McGill was very generous with me and others, and they allowed me to use what we call the stacks of their libraries. I'm just wondering if you got to do any of that in Britain.
Oh, well, I mean, I used to live in libraries. It's such a fantastic place to study. And yeah, I mean, that's, again, you've got to go to the source of where all this information is, regardless of whether you're an academic historian or a lay historian like myself. You've got to get your facts right. So, and a library is the best place for it, clearly.
So you were getting a D in history class, because let's just cut to the chase here. Yeah. You were bored, obviously. You weren't stimulated.
No, I was too busy watching Star Wars. And
All right. So you were a teenager, more stimulated by Star Wars than public school. Okay, yes. That's easy. Did you at some point, a fork in the road, choose not to go to university?
So yes, I think that's probably a fair comment. I definitely made a conscious decision because I was never 100% sure what I wanted to do. Writing's definitely been my calling since then, and it's certainly not something I'm opposed to going back to. But I also think sometimes when you're at a different, like an age as a teenager, sometimes these things can be thrust upon you, and either you're not ready for them or you just don't know what you want to do. And I feel like a lot of young people need to have more space to learn about themselves and understand where they are before these things are thrust down their throats necessarily. I mean, obviously it works for some people, but it just didn't for me.
So history became, let's call it what it is, it became a hobby for you.
Yes.
You weren't going to university, so how were you making a living?
So initially I was working in my small quintessentially village, like in my quintessentially English village post office. So I was working there, sort of just selling stamps and whatnot. But beneath the counter, I had my history books. I had my laptop to start writing. And I suppose my career in history really did start out on a little stool in a post office in the middle of a Kentish village.
My God, you're like a Netflix show. I mean, seriously.
Well, I don't know, maybe a couple of episodes, but it might get boring after a while.
No, I think this is terrific. There's this word autodidactic that I learned in university from a British professor, and it means self-taught. And I would say that Alex Bowers is autodidactic. What does Alex say?
Oh, no, I love that. It's such a beautiful word. I'm all for it.
So. All right, so let's go from the post office and having history as a hobby, as a passion. How did it go from history to Canadian military history?
So again, I think this is where my connection to Canada comes into play, because I'd grown up with stories of my mum first came out to Canada in the 1970s. I've got family here in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. And she first came out here to see them, and I'd grown up with her stories. So when I turned 21, I vowed that I was going to follow in her footsteps. And I first came out here in 2014 when I was 21, and I haven't looked back since. I've been coming out every other year, bar 2020 for perhaps obvious reasons. And I've just fallen in love with the country. I've fallen in love with Nova Scotia in particular. And I suppose those two things combined, my love for Canada and my love for telling these little known stories in history.
So, look, I think of myself as a Western Canadian, technically an adopted Western Canadian. I've spent more than a quarter of a century living in the West, but I'm from the East. I'm from Montreal and Toronto, essentially. That's where I grew up.
Oh, great.
However, no matter what I say to my friends in the Montreal and Toronto's about how friendly Western Canada is, I mean, heck, we even have friendly on our license plates in Manitoba. I have to, in the interest of 100% honesty, say that in terms of my personal, private experience, even though I never worked in Atlantic Canada, in terms of being based there, I've made, for professional reasons, several trips to Atlantic Canada. Mm-hmm. And at the risk of alienating some Western followers, I've got to say that the days and nights I spent in Atlantic Canada were overwhelmingly friendly, sometimes too friendly. I tend to like food. And while they overfeed me in Manitoba and Saskatchewan and Alberta, they really do a number on me. In Atlantic Canada, the hospitality is amazing.
Hospitality times 10 over here, right?
I'm just wondering if, and you're from a very friendly part of Great Britain and a village in southeastern England, would you say that Antigonish, Nova Scotia is on a par with the village you're from, Alex?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, certainly, again, I've got to say this. Canadians, as a rule of thumb, I'd say are wonderful people. Atlantic Canadians, certainly. Maritimers, yeah, they're just unbelievably hospitable and welcoming. I think from the moment I moved to Antigonish with my wife earlier this year, we felt like a part of the community the moment we set foot in this place. And I think that it just stands testament to I don't know, just the accepting nature of people over here.
Is there any connection between all the work you're doing on the computer, studying history, specifically Canadian military history, and getting married? I mean, I'm just wondering if there's a thread, if one thing leads to another.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I think, frankly, my wife is equally interested in history, but I think that I might have had a slight influence on that. I don't think necessarily. I mean, I suppose there's one could make an argument that there is a connection, but it was certainly post meeting that I introduced her to the world of history. But her history is completely different to mine. She's more into the Vikings and a lot further back than my period, my chosen period.
All right, well, then let me take you from history to the device you're using to study history, and that's the computer. If I'm overreaching and crossing boundaries, I don't mean to trespass, but is there a connection between the computer and meeting your wife?
Yes, 100%. Yeah. So when I first met my wife, it was because we both had a mutual interest in traveling the world. We both had the travel bug. And effectively, we were met for a mutual friend through Facebook, and we discussed the possibility of meeting up and talking about maybe traveling the world as companions. It seems like a ridiculous notion. I'd never met this person before, and here I was talking about traveling the world as friends, and perhaps unsurprisingly, that first meeting turned into a first date.
Now, you had some experience in Nova Scotia because of your mum, and you had visited a couple of times. Yeah. What about the bride? I mean, was it a leap for her to say yes to leaving Britain for Canada?
Again, she's always wanted to live somewhere else, but this is something that we've been toying with for many years, and we've always managed to talk ourselves out of it. And then it came to the pandemic, and suddenly we're trapped at home. And obviously our country did struggle quite a bit during that for reasons I won't get into here. But we just realized you only live once. People around us were really suffering, and we felt quite blessed to. I did obviously. I did suffer. I did get COVID, but we both managed to get out of it pretty pretty well. We got out all right. And I think thereafter we just realized, wow, you only live once. We just got to jump. And that's what we did. Soon after things started going back to some relative normality, we just tried to see what would happen. And we went, we'll give it a shot. And each thing that we were expecting to be a hurdle didn't become a hurdle. And it just felt like the universe was pointing us in this direction.
So how are you guys making a living now? I mean, I'm not going to presume that you're working at a post office in Antigonish. So no. What are you up to, Alex?
So, my wife has started. She works in a local greenhouse. She's, apart from being interested in history, she adores her plants, and she's found heaven here in Antigonish in her little greenhouse. So, meanwhile, I'm continuing to write about Canadian military history, trying to highlight Canada's wartime stories on both sides of the Atlantic now. I write for British magazines, I write for Canadian magazines, and I've also started making my own YouTube videos, trying to highlight some of the little-known stories. So, for example, recently I made a story about British evacuees that came over to Canada during the Second World War and made Canada their home, and some of the complex things that happened there from staying there for about 5 years, staying here for 5 years, and then returning home to a country that some of them couldn't remember. They were so young when they went there that Canada became their home, and going back to Britain, suddenly they've got Canadian accents. They don't understand post-war Britain. It's a country on its knees, and so many of them decided to return to Canada ultimately after the war.
So you've been living here for almost 6 months. You have visited a couple of times. Your mom has been living here for a while. Mm-hmm. Do you have the impression that people in Canada know very much about their own history?
It's a really difficult one. And I think I'm going to quote one of Canada's leading historians, Tim Cook, who he believes that Canada does struggle to tell its own story. And I think it's almost, and I mean, this is probably going to sound pretty strange coming from someone who's actually, making a living out of this. But I feel like it's important that there's more Canadian voices telling these stories. I feel, although I'm honored to play my part in telling them these stories, I would love to see more Canadians engaging with their history. I think it's so important. I think it really tells. You could learn so much. I mean, the saying goes, those who do not know their own history are condemned to repeat it. And Canada, as with so many countries, certainly with my country, has a complicated past that I feel is important to know about.
So, as you probably know, you don't have to live here for very long. We are dominated by American culture, and most of what I'm talking about is entertainment. It's Hollywood, it's movies, it's TV, even when it comes to news and the business that I've been raised in. There are many people who don't even watch very much Canadian news. They watch mostly American news. It's not Justin Trudeau, but his dad once talked about Canada being next door to the United States is kind of like the mouse and the elephant. Yeah. And so we pay lots of attention to the elephant. And just in the short time you've been here, but of course you've studied Canada and the U.S. From your perch in the village in southeast England. Do you think it's possible that Canadians in general, because of all the TV, the movies, the American pop culture that they have been exposed to, do you think that they just, it's not a voluntary thing, it just happens, that they end up learning more about American history just through TV and movies than they do about Canadian history? Is that part of why perhaps Canadian history is not as animating to the Canadian experience as it ought to be?
I certainly think that plays a factor in not only Canada, but so many countries. I mean, in Britain, again, despite the fact that, we do obviously have so many fascinating stories about like sort of the Second World War and other more complicated things. We've been brought up with Hollywood stories and, you look at, and in the context of Canada, going back to Canada, you think of one of the most famous war movies that's ever been made, and that's The Longest Day, where you've got so much discussion, or you see so much about the Americans during Operation Overlord, during D-Day. You see fair bit about the British too, but there's only really passing mention of the Canadians. It's almost as if they weren't there. And I think that's deeply problematic. I think it's Hollywood has this issue of, and you understand it. I mean, the Americans are so fantastic at telling their own stories, and I'd say that's to their credit. But we can't necessarily expect some of these other countries to necessarily tell Canadian stories on our behalf. I feel like the onus is on the Canadians to do that, and I'd like to think that maybe I'm playing my own small part from a British perspective, but again, this is where I'm coming back to. I feel it's important that Canadians really engage with their history because it's so fascinating. It's so important to learn. And yes, I think American pop culture certainly has had an influence on the fact that you've got this very US-centric view of war, of the Second World War.
Alex, every Canadian who has studied D-Day, which to many of us is one of the most important days ever, knows the name General Dwight D. Eisenhower. But very few people know, and of course they know Winston Churchill, but very few people know who led Canadian forces. I wonder if you could take us back to the 1940s and that D-Day battle. Canada was very, very involved. Who led us?
Well, you've got Harry Crerar, who was a very important figure in 1st Canadian Army that was leading a big deal of like the fighting during in and around Europe at that time. And, you have other figures that come into play equally important. But Harry Crerar, you've got moving through a lot of Normandy. And then you have Simmons, who takes over for a little while when Harry Crerar gets unwell, in probably what is one of the most consequential battles that Canada played a role in, which was the Battle of the Scheldt, which was absolutely vital because by this point, we're talking September, October 1944, where supplies to the Allied armies are still coming from the Normandy beachhead, despite the fact that the Allies are pushing ever further into Europe. And so the Canadians are involved in opening up the port of Antwerp in Belgium to facilitate the increased supply of these armies. The Germans have been taken over much of the area surrounding Port of Antwerp in what is known as the Scheldt Estuary. And the 1st Canadian Army are involved in absolutely brutal combat over several weeks to clear this pocket of fierce German resistance. They ultimately prevail, and it does enable all these supplies to come in. And it's also plays a role in perhaps, again, one of these important American moments, which is the Battle of the Bulge, is Hitler wants the port of Antwerp back. He realizes the strategic importance of that place. And that's part of the reason why you have that offensive that leads to the famous American Battle of the Bulge. So you could some people might argue that Canada's Battle of the Scheldt was, in a sense, the precursor to the Battle of the Bulge.
So let's go some spot west of not west. I got to get my geography straight here. East of Antwerp, Belgium. Let's go to Holland, the Netherlands. It's impossible for any of us who have visited the Netherlands, who are people privileged with Canadian passports, not to get a lot of hugs and kisses from the Dutch. We freed them.
Well deserved too.
Many Canadians are not aware of Canada liberating the Netherlands, but certainly every person who is Dutch learns this early in school, and they're eternally grateful. Tell us about the battles involving Canada, ferocious battles with Hitler's forces to liberate Holland.
Well, again, this is probably where my lack of qualifications probably is about to fail me, because I'm still very much learning on the spot. So I'm going to tread very carefully, because that's not something that I've studied quite as extensively of some other battles yet. But I'm working my way towards it, and it's been such a wonderful journey, unlocking each part of Canadian history as I've gone along, and I have been focusing a lot on the Scheldt recently. It's been a very important thing. I've been writing about it quite extensively. But obviously, I will say that, as you've rightly said yourself, Canada had such an important role in liberating the Netherlands. And when they went back there in 1995 for a very important anniversary, there are some really touching images of these by then aging veterans, getting kissed by the local people. And there's moments where you have children whose parents insist that they touch the hands of the veterans who had liberated them. And so they can say that they've played a part in that important moment in history. And I just think, as you say yourself, that relationship between the Netherlands and Canada is just, it's going to be prevailing for generations to come.
Alex, I have no sense that you want to run for office, but I want to tell you that you'd have to change your attitude and perhaps your character in order to be a politician, because I just love this conversation that we're having at all levels. And I'll tell you why. It is so brutally honest. It is very rare for a politician to tell you what they don't know. They're happy to tell you what they do know.
Yeah.
But if they're asked a question like I asked specifically about battles between the Canadians and Hitler's forces to liberate the Netherlands, you said that it wasn't something that you had very much knowledge of right now. You're studying some other battles, and you'll definitely go to the Netherlands at some point and study that as well.
I think
but
that's
not what a politician
No.
would say. And
No.
I'm not trying to make a blanket statement about all politicians. Some of them are extremely knowledgeable, and they're not just spinning. But you are doing zero spin right now.
No. I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? Because I feel like if you're going to be in this position where you're telling about history without the extensive background, I feel like I've got a duty to people to tell them about my limitations. I don't want to get the facts wrong, because these facts are so important, and I will talk about what I know, and I will leave what I don't to the academic historians who will do a far better job than I will.
So, Alex, as far as the Navy is concerned, the naval battles against Hitler's forces were extremely important, and Canada was very much involved with Britain, with the United States, with others. We don't have very much, I'm ashamed to say as a Canadian, we don't have very much of a Navy right now. But in the war, it was very, very significant. And there you are in Atlantic Canada, where you've got so many people active and retired with the Canadian Navy. I wonder if you'd like to give us something about what it's like being in Nova Scotia, Navy country.
Oh yeah, obviously it's got a very rich maritime history, and it's been really fascinating to speak to and engage with some of the local sort of experts in their field. I've got contacts in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, for example. And it's the Battle of the Atlantic is perhaps, if the Battle of the Scheldt was perhaps Canada's most important land engagement, the Battle of the Atlantic with the supplying of, bringing supplies to Britain was absolutely vital for the continuation of our country, Britain. I mean, we stood at this moment where we could have starved, frankly, without Canada's influence. And again, I think being in Nova Scotia, being surrounded by all of this rich heritage about maritime, you really feel like you can immerse yourself in that history and learn more about it. And it's been such a privilege to be afforded that opportunity.
So while you don't have a university pedigree, you've got something that to a lot of people is more important than that. You've got your own YouTube channel.
Yeah, I'll tread carefully with that, but sure thing.
So tell us what the name of it is. Tell us what you've been doing. I mean, I was watching a little bit of it earlier, and it was another reason I was excited about talking to you, because it too was absolutely brutally honest. There are very few people who are experts in their field at anything that come across as honest as you do. So it's very compelling watching. Tell us what the name of it is, why you called it that, and how you're doing with your YouTube channel.
Okay, well, so it's called Past Blast. I have struggled to get my mouth around it at times, which seems like a great brand name, right? But I've just created this YouTube channel to try and highlight Canada's contribution the same way that I've been doing it through my writing. And as you say, my introduction, I have a video on there where I state quite explicitly that I am not a qualified historian. But I make a pledge to anyone that the things that come out of my mouth are accurate to my knowledge, based on primary sources. And yeah, so it's a bit of a fledgling thing at the moment. I've only made 2 videos, one being the introduction and one being that video I was mentioning earlier on British evacuees in Canada. But it's going to be, I'm hoping, an opportunity for me to tell other stories. Like I intend to tell a story of a military facility not too far from where I'm living, actually, called Camp Norway, which is in Lunenburg. And again, this is where after the Nazis had invaded Norway, a lot of these Norwegian sailors that had been out to sea, they couldn't go back to their homeland, so they came to Canada and they ended up establishing a military facility there. And it's a lovely story too, because initially, you had this strange dynamic between Canadians and Norwegians, but they managed to work out their differences and form a very strong bond. And again, a lot of Canadians married these Norwegian sailors, and a lot of Lunenburg, the people of Lunenburg, can trace their heritage to Norwegian people. And I hope to tell these smaller stories that perhaps don't often get as much attention as others.
Past Blast History.
That's the one.
Past Blast History is Alex Bauer's YouTube channel. Alex, I definitely want to bring you back down the road and find out how you're making out in Atlantic Canada. And I'm got my fingers crossed here that you'll travel west someday and visit me in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia. But somewhere in Western Canada, I'd love to share a pot of coffee or some kind of adult beverage. I do want to thank you. I've got to tell you, because most people are going to be listening to this, not watching, so it's incumbent upon me to tell them that despite the fact that you're in Atlantic Canada, where they overfeed all people who are from anywhere else in Canada or anywhere else in the world, somehow, I guess you do enough exercise, not just of the mind, but the body, that you haven't fattened up yet in Nova Scotia. Is it fair to ask the question, how many pounds have you put on in the last 6 months, rather, being the recipient of Atlantic Canadian generosity?
Oh, I mean, I've been quite conscious of my weight. Absolutely. I've definitely put on a couple of pounds since being here, because I've been pretty excited about the novelty of picking up things in the local superstore that I couldn't get back in Britain. So I've been going to town on pickle chips, for example. I love those. I can't get enough of them.
Well, anyway, I want to congratulate you on so many things, including your self-discipline, your relatively new marriage, and most important, your recent arrival in our country. Welcome to Canada once again. Welcome to the Charles Adler Show podcast. Thank you so much for everything that you're doing, not just for your family, but for our country, Alex.
Thank you, Charles.
Alex Bauer is in Antigonish, Nova Scotia. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, the Charles Adler Show podcast, available on any platform, any of the major platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, everywhere you get your podcasts. Thank you.
Catch Charles Adler Mondays on Real Talk with Ryan Jesperson, twice a week in the Winnipeg Free Press, and every day at criermedia.co.